Over the last 3 days and tonight, right now, there is another set of air attacks going against the Russian Federation being launched by the Ukrainian drone forces as we speak. But over the last 3 days, the Ukrainian armed forces have launched a series of drone and long range attacks centered on Russia's export capacity. While the Ukrainian armed forces have been launching attacks against Russia's energy sector for years now, the rate of drone production has continued to rise. The specifics on how those drone productions are altered to try to focus for this task are improved, and the targeting from these drones has also improved. Where before they would kind of, I don't want to say blindly throw, but aim towards the facility and hit what they hit. Maybe they hit a storage container. Maybe they hit a facility that is important, supporting staff. Maybe they hit some component that needs to be imported and replaced. But whatever they hit, they hit. Where since then, due to in part intelligence that was provided by John Ratcliffe CIA and just getting to learn what they're going about, they have been better at targeting. They have more drones, and they have, I don't want to say perfected drone warfare, but they have certainly continued to fine tune drone production and the drones that they are throwing at the Russians. And so this has led to the Russians feeling not only more pressure against the refineries, which they use to produce higher price tag items that they sell overseas, but general supportive infrastructure for the energy sector. There has been certain parts of the energy sector, though, despite all of these attacks, that have been sheltered. And it has been sheltered by the United States. During the Biden administration, one of the things that the Biden administration wanted to avoid was massive Ukrainian strikes on Russian export terminals that could disrupt the global energy market. There was a fear within the Biden administration of what that would mean for American consumers, what that would mean for world economic, stability and the price of oil. And so what they preferred was that the Ukrainians, instead of focusing on the export terminals, which is going to lower the amount of total Russian Brent crude from the Urals that are being exported to the world, they could instead target the refineries by which takes that crude and makes it a higher ticket price item and allowing them to sell it at a higher price and make more money. Instead, they would have to sell it at a lower price, both keeping international energy markets stable because other countries could, refine it elsewhere, while also still cutting into the price tag of the Russian Federation. Now, this has been somewhat frustrating for the Ukrainians because the export terminal it's the node. It is the central node by which this product gets to the international market. And they have a few central nodes across the country, many of them very far from Ukraine. But if they were to strike them and they were to damage the port infrastructure, if they were to damage what loads the fuel onto the ships, if they were to damage, say, a lot of shadow vessels in the port itself, if they were able to do this damage, then it doesn't matter if the Russians are producing oil, they have to be able to export oil. And they only have so much physical infrastructure that they could use in the Asian region towards China that could get fuel over the Chinese or the Indians and sell it there through pipelines. They simply don't have all the pipelines in place necessary to export all of their product. And so they need these ports. They are essential for the Russian government to keep their operation sustainable and profitable. Over 50% of Russian state-owned energy companies are already unable to turn a profit. If you take out their ability to export it through these ports, then they're not going to be able to make a profit. And what helps fuel the war effort is the energy sector. It helps fuel 30 to 40% of the entire state budget. If you take out 30 to 40%, hell, 20% of the state budget, then they will not be able to fund the war effort. Now, with Donald Trump's war in Iran, energy prices have gone up. The price per barrel has gone up from, we're talking high 60s to low 70s to high 80s, low 90s to even over $100 a barrel some days, depending upon what Trump posts on Truth Social. And we're going on 4 weeks, which is what Trump said was the ahead of schedule deadline that he put out at the start of this operation. So how long this is going to go on, I do not know. I know the exemptions that the United States put on Russian sanctions is until April 11th. Past that point, they can extend those sanctions, helping the Russians make more money, but through Trump's view, helping to stabilize international energy markets. Donald Trump said that his kicking down the can of the road on this continued negotiations with the Iranians, that they're going to lapse this round of negotiation in 10 days. So we're talking early April, early going towards mid-April. So how long this is going to go, I have no clue. Dr. JW, thanks for the tier 1. Appreciate that. What I do know is that the Russians love the spike in oil, and they want to take advantage. They love that sanctions have been removed from them, and they want to take advantage. If you go listen to Russian state media, they are gushing about this. They are joyous about this. They are saying that this is the lifeline that the Russian economy needed. It is universally accepted consensus in Russia by economists that they are headed towards a recession. It's a question of what that post-war recession, or even during the war recession, is going to look like. Of course, the latter being worse than the former. This is something that can help them keep the national wealth fund afloat when there has been a lot of talk of them possibly draining it as early as this year. Not next year, not the year after that, this year. And so this is a lifeline for the Russians, which estimated if they were to keep rates where they are and they were to go through this like through the midterms, if the Iranians don't budge and the United States doesn't budge, assuming that they keep this going like this, then that's assuming a lot. But of course, a lot of damage can be done to Middle East oil infrastructure in a very short period of time. So, there is a need to be careful. But if the situation were just to continue as is, the Russians would make an extra $40 billion in energy sales. Money that is desperately needed for the war coffers, money that is desperately needed to keep the Russian government trudging forward. Now, there is something to be said about the man who pledged to end the war in 24 hours making decisions that continuously drag the war out as long as physically possible. But that is not the focus of this segment. That has been the focus of many other segments. It's not the focus of this one. The focus of this segment is what the Ukrainians are doing to counteract this. See, the Ukrainians held their hands to some capacity, and in other instances simply did not attain the capacity to put out the amount of drones necessary for some of these operations, or have the length and the range that they have now to engage in these sort of operations. But now they do. And they wanted to keep a cordial relationship with the Trump administration. But right now, the Trump administration is making clear that its position is that the Ukrainians should give up the Donbass in order to attain security guarantees. And it is not just me saying this. We have heard that directly from Zelensky, and we're also hearing that directly from the Russians, who are also talking about this. I think we have it right here.
Что Соединенные Штаты, раз господин Зеленский иногда комментирует это все, я бы просто обратил внимание на его высказывание вчера. И он сказал важную вещь. Он сказал, что он наконец-то понял, что Соединенные Штаты дадут гарантии безопасности Украине только если Украина полностью уйдет из Донбасса. И вот это понимание, которое он озвучил вчера, это, в общем, не может не радовать, потому что он, наконец, понял, что позиция Соединенных Штатов в том, что они поддержат гарантии безопасности только если Украина уходит из Донбасса, он об этом публично сказал.
So, the Ukrainians are not going to accept that position. That is an unacceptable position from the Ukrainian perspective. They're not going to displace 100,000 people. And the current trend economically for oil markets benefits the Russians. So they cannot concede. They cannot, and not to mention the territory is being asked as the most defensible territory that's been built up over years, that is being asked to be conceded without a fight, as the Russians struggle to get a strong foothold into the central hub in Konstantinivka, which is then, of course, you need to get through Druskivka, and then you've got to get to Kramatorsk, and its twin city of Slovyansk, which, if you look at it from above, you can't see the entirety of the Twin Cities. It is a very large area. I've been there many times. So the Ukrainians have to change the trajectory economically for the Russians. And with Trump starting a war that is sending up the price of oil, the Ukrainians have seemingly come to the conclusion, why do they need to keep their hands behind their back for the United States to divert Pearl resources? This is the program by which Ukraine and Europe was able to purchase American defense exports, send them to Europe, and then send them over to the Ukrainians. If they're going to divert those over towards the Middle East, meaning less interceptors for the Ukrainian war effort, and at the same time willing to send the oil markets into a tizzy over this war with Iran, but then ask the Ukrainians not to go after the export terminals that would take a lot less drones to do economic damage to the Russians than continuously going after all these refineries across the country. Doing both does damage, but the former does a lot more damage with a lot less output. So the Ukrainians have made the determination It is time to go after the export terminals, and it's time to go after them in a concentrated manner when the markets right now already look somewhat unstable. Somewhat unstable is putting it lightly, with 20% of the world's product being held up, not to mention with 25 to 35% of the world's fertilizers, which is hurting places like Sudan and Pakistan pretty severely. They think this is the moment. And by God, they have done a lot of work. As of speaking right now, 40% of their export capacity, according to a Reuters estimate, has been disabled. That doesn't mean destroyed. I'm sure a lot of those facilities have been damaged to the point of destruction. I'm sure that if there's other facilities that when invested, they might be able to be up and running again in a month or two. But the fact that 40% was disabled within just a couple of days, 3 days to be exact, shows that these ports are vulnerable. They cannot protect them with the air defense that is there now, particularly the Leningrad Oblast, which did not expect to be attacked. And if I show you the drone that did it, this is some wily coyote. This is some wily coyote war making right now. I want to thank Wily Coyote for joining the Ukrainian Armed Forces. That bomb on the bottom of that plane, this looks like the type of bomber plane somebody would think up in a children's book. Like if I was 7 and they asked me to design a bomber plane, I would draw something like this, much cruder, of course, with crayon and pencil in a book. But at the end of the day, you got to think of it from the Ukrainian perspective. You need something that is cheap. This type of plane is cheap, that can carry a bomb quite a distance and can be commanded from a distance. So these three things together, it's cheap, it can go quite the distance, and I mean, it's not like there's a shortage of these types of aircraft in the world. It might look ridiculous, but that doesn't mean it doesn't work. In fact, it very much did work, and it did quite a lot of damage to the Leningrad Oblast. This actually, I believe, did damage particularly to a ship that was supposed to carry like hypersonic missiles and all this type. It was up for production to be released in 2028. But the more damaging immediate impact has been towards oil and gas infrastructure, 40% disabled. Here is some footage released by the Ukrainian Armed Forces. Turn off the rock music, but you can see the different locations throughout the week, the 23rd of March, the 25th of March, and the 26th of March, as they struck targets all over the Leningrad Oblast and at other export terminals. You can see the smoke, a lot of it, of course, being from burning fuel and storage containers, because you a lot of times store the fuel before you load the fuel. And you can see that the smoke rose all over the surrounding area. Leningrad has largely been preserved from the worst throes of the war. There has been one or two or a few drone attacks in this area, but they were years ago, and they were so few and far in between that its damage could be marked as non-substantial. By the way, if you're curious as to what this was, this is the marker from like satellite footage, basically indicating where heat and explode. It's a marker of oh boy, that hurts. Okay, to put it lightly. Anyway, this is not Leningrad 2 years ago. This is Leningrad after air defenses have been spread over the whole country, as Russia's trying to protect its oil and gas infrastructure, has been stretched out further and further in places like Crimea and inside of Ukraine, in the rest of Ukraine, because when you stretch out those air defense systems, they get damaged and they have to be replaced. And so now this is Leningrad today, when Ukraine has better targeting, has better drones, has more range, and has more drones. So this is a very different circumstance to what it was a few years ago. And so that has led to a much different result. The result before was, tens to hundreds of millions of dollars in damage maybe, but, nothing substantially long-term undermining their ability to produce. Now you have something that can actually threaten the Russian war machine. You have something that can not only threaten the war machine, you can threaten the state's ability to finance itself. And the problem is if they were able to consistently, because right now they're doing it again, literally right now. Here's some footage. So this is kilometers away from, again, Leningrad Oblast, but you can see they're still targeting the port infrastructure. They're still targeting the energy infrastructure. This is day 4 of mass drone attacks. If you can't export product, and if the storage terminals are blowing up, I mean, even if the storage terminals were not blowing up, If you damage their export infrastructure, if you disable it, if you disable a lot of their storage units, they don't just stop exportation, they stop production. If you have nowhere to export your fuel, if you have nowhere to store your fuel, you have to shut down facilities. If at the same time you're facing that crisis, you also have drones going towards your refineries, then you've got an even bigger problem on your hands. And that is something that's happening at the moment. Now, I'm not saying that it's at the point where they have to shut it down. Their first reaction is going to be pouring whatever money and manpower and resources is necessary to try to get these ports back online, get the infrastructure fixed. They're going to be working 24/7, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. They're going to be doing it immediately. They're going to try their best. But at the end of the day, if every time they try to fix it, more bombs come in, then there's not much that they can do. And so the question is, does Ukraine have the capacity to keep throwing drones at Russia? Right now, yes. Does Ukraine have the will to keep doing it? Obviously. Does Russia have the air defenses necessary to move into the region and protect the Leningrad Oblast, protect all these facilities? Yes and no. Yes, they have air defense that could be moved in the Leningrad Oblast. No, they don't have enough air defenses to be moved over the largest country on the planet. They didn't think Ukraine would be bombing them. They thought that they would be bombing Ukraine. And that is the problem that the Russians are running into. They thought war was a one-player game, and it isn't. This is the result of that. And so I have to ask, in this moment, when Ukrainian drone capacity and drone production is at such a stage that they can do this damage this deep into Russia, when at this moment the Russians are having problems trying to keep the Russian economy afloat from the issue of recession, from the issue of inflation, when it comes to people's cost of living, when it comes to just financing the war itself, why at this moment are we choosing to launch a war of choice that doesn't only, hey, maybe it settles a certain amount of war adventurism. Maybe, you can get to a deal that means no atomic bomb for Iran, even though it doesn't look like we're any closer to that. Good luck. Yeah, I didn't plan this. But why is it that we're now diverting resources from the Pearl program away from Ukraine, specifically the PAC interceptors that are necessary to take down the ballistic missiles that Ukraine cannot intercept? Let me be for real with you guys. Ukraine has the capacity to take down Russian drones. They do. They have anti-drone cowboys that go around on the back of pickup trucks to try to shoot them down. A lot of them don't have success. Some of them do, but that takes out a number of the drones. They also have some air defense systems provided by Western Europe, the Gepard systems like that. They work very effectively. Those shells tear apart Russian Shaheds. They have the capacity to produce interceptor drones, and this has had expanding success within Ukraine. And that success is even so world renowned that the Saudis want in, the UAE wants in, a bunch of different Gulf states that are now under the threat of Russian Iranian drones. As they're under that threat, they want in on that. So Ukraine has capacities and a choice on whether they can expand that or expand this. They don't have ballistic missile interceptors. They do not. That is one capacity the Ukrainians have not developed. We continue to see long-range missile capacity be developed at a pace that is somewhat mysterious. In the Flamingo, with the Flamingo project, you've got interceptors for the drones, but ballistic missile interception is namely the game of the United States. And if you were to listen to Zelensky right now, he's making posts directly pointing this out as the Pearl program takes these interceptors and moves them to our forces in the Middle East. He is saying that we cannot rely on forces outside of Europe for European air defense. We might want to continue to get more interceptors from the United States. Zelensky thanked the United States for the interceptors yesterday that are being purchased, mind you. We're thanking them for purchases. But again, they have to make the decision to sell it. So they've done all this work. Wait 1 second. Is another site getting attacked? Sorry. Okay, I'm back. But essentially what Zelensky was saying is that they need a domestic European ballistic missile defense system that they can produce at some scale that could then be given to the Ukrainians to use in Ukraine. Because they have the capacity to take out drones, but if those ballistic missiles are targeted towards Ukrainian factories, towards Ukrainian defense, towards Lviv and UNESCO World Heritage Sites, which I saw how UNESCO responded when those World Heritage Sites in Lviv, which has buildings in Lviv that are older than both Russia and Ukraine itself and the concepts of them. And they wouldn't even name that it was the Russians doing it. So obviously, if these types of world organizations, NGOs are not going to do something, the United States isn't going to do something, then Europe at some point has to do something. But they don't have that project off the ground. This is something that Ukraine is saying they have to invest in now. So what can they do in the midterm? What can they do now under this ballistic missile threat? Well, they have to preserve whatever they can get from the United States and encourage European countries that have their own supply of missiles, ballistic, anti-air defense missiles, not ballistic, but, air defense missiles that could take out ballistic missiles. They have to give their internal reserves. And that could mean running low on reserves. But when you talk to every single European defense planner in Germany or in France or whatever, you say, what's your threat? What's the threat to France? What's the threat to Germany? None of them says Spain. Nobody says Ireland. Nobody says the United Kingdom is going to land in Brittany once more. Nobody says any of this. You know what they say? They say the Russians. The Russians are the first one. The Russians are the second one. The Russians are the third one. So until the United States can make up that gap, or until European states can produce enough anti-air defense systems to make up that gap, they have to be able to find the interceptors wherever they can, whether that be in the United States, whether that be in their internal reserves, whether it be whatever production does exist, or whether that means other providers of air defense systems, or anywhere, Asia, elsewhere, planet Mars. But these factories that are producing these drones to bring the war to Russia are going to be a primary target. I also think that the Russians are going to target Ukraine's ports. I think Odessa is going to be a major target. I said yesterday, and I will say again, if you live in Odessa, and I know I have viewers in Ukraine, I have people who tune in, both English speakers and some people who are native. If you live in Odessa, you should be listening to every single air defense siren and going to a bunker. Or at the very least, if you can't bother, bring your bed or sleeping bag or a pillow into the corridor. Because I'm telling you, if they think that Russia's export capacity is being targeted, they're going to target Ukraine's export capacity. Obviously, they cannot destroy a land border with Romania and Poland, but they can destroy port infrastructure in Odessa, which would, of course, increase the burden on Ukrainian farmers when it comes to the exportation of grain. It's one thing to have to pay a higher insurance premium because there's Russian sea drones floating around Odessa that they have dropped out there. Not Russian sea drones, Russian sea mines. It's another thing to be directly bombed by a Russian Kinzhal. That's another thing entirely. By the way, Ukraine doesn't have nearly enough interceptor drones as is. Territory is huge. We've had few drone strikes recently, even in my city, Dnipro, which rarely gets struck, and Lviv got hit recently too. Yeah, like I said, the UNESCO World Heritage Site in Lviv, they were getting hit by drones. They were getting hit by Russian long-range attacks. It is true that Ukraine still doesn't have enough anti-air defense systems for the drones, but they can produce that. They cannot produce. And what do they do? You're Ukraine and you don't have any Western-provided missile interceptors. You know what you do? You tank the missile. That is what you do. If you do not have ballistic missile interceptors, then you have to make the calculation of which missiles do we shoot down and which missiles don't, of them putting these interceptor systems only around the most vital of defense armaments in order to continue pressure on the Russians, which means that you won't be able to always defend a missile if it slams into a children's cancer ward, which has happened before. You won't be able to stop them from hitting every factory. You won't be able to stop them from hitting every barracks. You won't be able to stop them from hitting training grounds. You won't be able to stop them from hitting civilian apartments, and you won't be able to stop them from hitting other locations across Western Ukraine, Central Ukraine, and Eastern Ukraine. So at the same time that the Ukrainians are able to show the most capacity to throw drones into Russia, Russia is also still throwing it as quite the capacity to do the same back towards Ukraine. But Ukraine has been crossing more distance when it comes to covering more distance when it comes to making up the drone capacity between them and Russia. And Russia is still a much bigger country. And so, of course, it has its own unique challenges, but that doesn't stop the fact that Ukraine still needs missile interceptors from somewhere. And the United States seems more focused on pushing back against the Iranian threat to American bases that accumulated post the Israeli-American operation against Iran. Still, this is quite significant. quite significant.
That